To understand ancient Egypt, we need to have an understanding of how historians and archaeologists have broken up time periods in Egypt. There are three different kingdoms: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. And these kingdoms denote periods when Egypt has been unified under the control of one family. Um, and in between these kingdoms, there are what we call intermediate periods, which denote a break when Egypt has been disunified through external forces, usually. Um, and both of these periods are broken up into what we call dynasties, which is where we have one single family ruling. And when that family breaks apart and they no longer rule and another family takes over, then we see a new dynasty start. So the dynasty that Hatshepsut belongs to is called the 18th dynasty, which spanned from 1550 to 1292 BC. And it was probably the most known of the dynasties. This is the dynasty where we have the most famous pharaohs, including Tutankhamun, but we don't study Tutankhamun because he's a little bit late in the 18th dynasty. We finish with Thutmose IV. And because there are so many Thutmoses, we call this sometimes the Thutmose dynasty, because we have four different pharaohs named after Thutmose I, who is probably Thutmose I and Thutmose III, as well as Hatshepsut, are probably the most famous pharaohs during this period. So in the early part of the 18th dynasty, where Hatshepsut slots in, a bit of an overview. The dynasty was founded by Ahmose I, who was either the brother or the son of Kamose, and he was the last ruler of the 17th dynasty. And he finished the campaign to expel the Hyksos, which were a tribal group who'd invaded Egypt some time before. His reign is seen as the end of the second intermediate period and the start of the New Kingdom. And he was succeeded by his son, Amenhotep I, whose reign was pretty uneventful, not much happened. Amenhotep I probably left no male heir because his reign was quite short. And so Thutmose I seems to have been related to the royal family through marriage, and he came to power. During his reign, the borders of Egypt extended a great deal, as far north as Carchemish on the Euphrates and up to Kyrgyz beyond the Fourth Cataract in the south. Thutmose I was succeeded by Thutmose II and his queen Hatshepsut, and she was the daughter of Thutmose I, and soon after her husband's death ruled over 20 years after becoming pharaoh during the minority of her stepson, who later would become pharaoh, Thutmose III. So she ruled as a co-regent for Thutmose III, and there's a bit of an argument that she probably had more claim to the throne than did Thutmose III, because he didn't share exactly the same royal lineage as he did, because he was from a minor wife. So either way, she ruled on his behalf until he became old enough to rule in his own right, and then they ruled in what we call a co-regency, so they ruled together, both as pharaohs. And Thutmose III was to become the greatest military pharaoh ever, which truly was the epitome of the warrior pharaoh image during this period. He also had quite a lengthy reign after he became pharaoh, and he had a second co-regency in his old age with his son Amenhotep II. Now, Amenhotep II was succeeded by Thutmose IV, who in turn was followed by his son Amenhotep III, but we finished with the death of Thutmose IV. So this is a period of fantastic building programs, expansion into other areas, trade with other areas, and domination of areas that had not been dominated for a long period of time. So it's a very important period of Egyptian history. Egypt is located in the northeastern region of Africa, and it's bordered to the north by the Mediterranean Sea. The Nile River, which is the most prominent geographical feature, runs northward and comes out of the Mediterranean Sea in the form of a delta. The Nile is fed by two rivers, the Blue Nile and the White Nile, and that's the reason why it doesn't dry out in the dry seasons. There are 6 cataracts further south towards Africa, which make travelling the length of the Nile difficult by boat. Every year the Nile would flood because the snow from the mountains in Africa melted. And this flood, or inundation as it was called, brought with it nutrients in the form of silt. The silt was deposited on the left and right hand bank of the Nile, leaving 2 fertile strips for agriculture. The soil was quite moist and it was very, very fertile, and it allowed the Egyptians to grow a vast variety of crops. The ancient Egyptians used the floods for horticultural and domestic uses, and both sides of the Nile had these fertile strips. And the water was used by the Egyptians also for irrigation purposes for these crops. As a result of this fertile geographical area, the Greek historian Herodotus called Egypt the gift of the river. These strips were known as the Black Land of Egypt, as opposed to the Red Land, which was the desert land, which was further east and west of the Black Land. And this area of land protected Egypt from potential invaders. This area was incredibly harsh desert. There were a lot of dry wastelands. However, there were some mineral and stone resources throughout there. Also bordering the fertile valley were limestone cliffs, and they also protected the Egyptians from invasion and were also a good source of limestone for building, etc. Due to the flooding of the Nile, there were 3 seasons. There was the flood, which was the Arket, the sowing, which was the Peret, and the harvesting, which was the Shern. The Egyptians grew many crops, including wheat, barley, legumes, lettuce, onions, emmer, leeks, dill, grapes, melons, and gourds. They also grew trees like Christ's thorn, date palm, and eucalyptus. Some of the other plants that they used were flowers, such as the lily and lotus, the tamarisk, papyrus, acacia, and jacaranda. Although they didn't have a whole heap of trees for building boats. Most of those sort of trees that they needed for building boats had to be brought in from other areas. There was also a variety of animals, including shellfish and fish in the Nile River itself, which also had the crocodile. The other thing that's worth noting is that Egypt is divided into 2 sections: Upper Egypt, which is actually to the south, and Lower Egypt, which is the area to the north. When we look at ancient Egypt's neighbours in the 18th dynasty, and with Hatshepsut in particular, there are 3 main areas where we see relationships between Egypt and her neighbours. So that's either for trade or mining activities, for expeditions for stock or slaves, and also for military campaigns. So the desert to the east and to the west, and the sea to the north, acted as a bit of a natural barrier and a protective barrier for the Egyptian people, and the Nile with the cataracts also acted as another barrier to the south. And that's what sort of isolated Egypt. The Mediterranean, which they call the Great Green, was to the north, and that became more common for contact between Egypt and other areas in the 18th dynasty, particularly with the Aegean peoples, for instance, the Cretans, and there was tribute and trading between these people. In the west, there's Libya, and the tribes were succumbed to raids from the Egyptians throughout this period to punish them, etc. In the northern lands, there was the Mitanni, who were from the land of Naharin, and they were located on the east of the Euphrates River, and they extended west into Syria. Several campaigns were led against them by New Kingdom kings until Amenhotep III allied Egypt to them through a marriage. Syria was a northern neighbour. It was a crossroads of major trade routes, and Egypt exerted some control over this area, but the small city-states of Syria constantly changed and moved around. Nubia was an area to the south. It's sort of where modern-day Sudan is, and it offered a variety of wealth of trade from Africa in the form of mercenaries, Medjay troops, and resources such as gold mines. From the early 18th dynasty, Egyptian kings were active in their domination of Nubia, extending their influence beyond the Fourth Cataract, which was pretty far down. Parts of it were incorporated into Egypt, with Lower Nubia being regarded almost Egyptian by right. And we see this with Hatshepsut, particularly with the expedition to Punt. In Palestine, which was another northern neighbour, the Asiatics, which were probably where the Hyksos came from, their expulsion heralded the commencement of a period of aggressive expansion into the region in the 18th dynasty by the pharaohs. Successive campaigns against many small city-states resulted in much wealth from tribute and booty. The Sinai was also a northern neighbour, northeast of Egypt, and it was important mainly for mining and as a route into Palestine. And there were skirmishes between the Egyptians and the Bedouins over wells during the New Kingdom